مرحبا. اللي صار بلبنان منه هين، وكلنا عنا أسئلة ومش عارفين كيف بدنا نفكر، كيف بدنا نفكر مع أولادنا، كيف بدنا نفكر قصص يمكن practical أو قصص حتى روحيا كيف بدنا نجاوب. ففي شخص ريك توماس كتير بحب خدمته. فيكن تقروا عنه أكتر rickThomas.net. هو عمل مثل ويب سايت اللي بيحكي فيه في كتير ارتكلز تقروها، بودكاست تسمعوها. عندي كتير أسئلة لأسأله إياها عن كيف نحن نتعامل بهيك وضع مع أولادنا، كيف نحن نهتم بحالنا لنقدر نحن نهتم بأولادنا. سألت بعض الأهالي وأسئلة لشوف هن كمان شو بيحبوا يسألوا. نحن بدنا نحكي مع ريك هلا، إن شاء الله تكون هيدي الانترفيو لبنياننا، لتشجعنا وتخلينا هيك نتذكر رجائنا الأبدي بالمسيح. أول شيء لسلم على ريك ناطرني بالعربي. هاي ريك.
Oh, hello, Joyce. How are you? I thank you for having me on the video. I did not realize that I could speak Arabic. I heard you say Rick Thomas. I heard you say articles and podcast and website. So I didn't realize I could speak Arabic. So I'm very
That's good. That's good.
I'm encouraged. Thank you again for having me.
Thank you. When you come to Lebanon, you can use these words, to make sure people understand what you're saying. Thank you for joining, and thank you for being generous enough with your time to listen to our questions. I spoke to a lot of moms in Lebanon after the blast that happened, and they all have questions. I have questions. I'm not in Lebanon at the moment, but the pain and the fear and the sadness that has affected all of us because of it is huge. And I'm sure the people in Lebanon at the moment are also going through a lot of unknowns, a lot of pain, because there doesn't seem to be any way out.
Right.
So we have a lot of questions. If I want to start at the beginning with what we call trauma or what we call suffering, how do we define what happened, and how do we see it in our children and in ourselves?
Yes, there's several questions there, and the first one, what is trauma, or is trauma real? Trauma is real, even if we don't label it as such. Trauma is something that happens to us. It's an event that happens. But the best way to think about trauma is to think of it as a basket word, because trauma in itself, it has several different iterations or different ideas that are connected to it. And so if you're helping someone who is going through trauma, what you want to do is to get inside of this big word and see some of the effects of trauma. For example, if there was a word cloud around the word trauma, one of the words that you would see would be fear. That is a part of trauma. You would see worry, you would see anxiety, anxiousness, anger is also would be connected to trauma. And so trauma in itself can just be a big word that I'm not sure how to describe, but then when you start breaking down into a more granular level, you begin to see these little indicators like fear, worry, anxiety, even jealousy and envy, for example, for people who are not going through what I am going through, or anger would be definitely a part of trauma. Numbing would be, grief would be another word that would be connected to trauma. So if you put all of these words together, if you said that I have a person who is fearful and anxious and worry and grieving and envious and angry, it sounds to me like they've been traumatized by something. And so a lot of times it's better to break the word down into specific categories in order to understand what the larger word is.
Wow. Well, if it's all that happening at once and to kind of a whole country at the same time. So right. If something happens to me but did not happen to the other person, then maybe that other person can help me. But if we're all in this right. together, then, how does that work? We're all angry, we're all bitter, we're all jealous, we're all numb,
Yeah. Well, both of those individuals can help the sufferer. The person who's not affected by it can help because they're not emotionally entangled in the effect of what is going on. And so I think most of us understand, like someone coming to an event, a tragedy from the outside and bringing care. They don't bring the emotional baggage as far as being affected by it in an acute way, like the victims of the trauma. Okay, so that makes sense. For those of us who are in it at the same time, what you're going to see is there are different levels of maturity, different levels of responses. And so you really want to identify. I mean, the leaders will rise up and they just have a leadership gift and they're able to be able to rise up and to bring care. One of the things about suffering, suffering requires leadership. Without, I mean, you have to lead yourself through suffering. Some people can do that and some people can't, but suffering and leadership actually go hand in hand in order to suffer well. But unfortunately, for whatever reason, it's hard for everyone to suffer well. But some people can. They have the ability. Maybe they have been a believer much longer. Maybe they have had more teaching and training in God's word. Maybe they have a personality that is in such a way that they just naturally can take charge in a good sense of that word. And so they know how to suffer well. They can lead themselves through the agony that they're going through. And of course, they can lead others as well. And so it would be critical when everyone is collected in the tragedy and they're all traumatized by it, those leaders will begin to rise up, and you want to identify them and mobilize them so that they can care. Jesus, for example, in the Garden of Gethsemane, was the one most traumatized because he was the epicenter of everyone's anger, everyone's rage, everyone's desire to kill him. And so he was the epicenter. But what you see in that moment in the Garden of Gethsemane, his leadership to where he's leading Peter. Peter, put up your sword. He's actually leading his friends. And you'll see that with some people. Everybody suffers, and so there's no other option in a fallen world. We all suffer, but there are some people that have a level of gifting or experience or maturity or ability, whatever words we want to use. And so they can suffer more effectively. And of course, Jesus is an example of that. Another illustration of that, I'll just give you one more. In John 11, when Lazarus was dying and did die eventually, Mary and Martha and Jesus were suffering. We know that Jesus was suffering because he wept in John 11:35. And so he carried the burden and the agony and the pain, as well as Mary and Martha. But what we saw with Mary and Martha, we saw their impatience, we saw their anger, we saw their frustration, we saw their worry, we saw their anxiety. Again, those are some of the component parts in a trauma that was happening. And the trauma in their situation was their brother was dying. Well, Jesus was affected by it as well, but yet he did not respond the way they did. And so that's the person that you want to identify so they can lead. And of course, Jesus led so effectively through that trauma event that even the Jews who were standing by, they were affected by how Christ not only loved Lazarus, but also how he managed that event. So that would be another illustration of leadership through suffering.
Yeah.